So we spent the first half of the session talking about kind of what science knows, what are the scientific approaches, targeting leadership, organizational adaptation. But I want to shift for a second. If we step away from interdiction for just a second and say, okay, how do some of these TCOs fail, right? If we go back to that definition of failure, how do these organizations fail? Let's talk about that definition. If we step away from disconnecting and dismantlement and talk about the inability to perform a normal function, the inability to perform that function that that organization was carrying out, what ultimately led to that? But really, it's this kind of philosophical shift between looking at dismantlement versus failure. Now, we look at dismantlement and we put a focus on disconnection. We often also realize that that leads to splintered networks, and so the networks can still function. Remember, if we go back to that small worlds concept, if there's something that you leave here from today, I hope it's a greater understanding of some of these network concepts we're talking about. If we go back to small worlds, you have clusters connected by bridges. Those clusters connected by bridges, you cut the bridge off, great. You've disconnected the network. Crap. Those clusters are still effective supply chains. They become new organization, right? This can be done from interdiction or it can be done internally, right? But think about Beltran-Levia, right? Those individuals splintered off from the Sinaloa cartel, about 2007, 2008. And yet still those organizations carried on and actually were able to increase their capabilities post that time period. So if you disconnect, and that's your focus on countering TCOs, you're going to lead to a lot of splintering, which actually can decrease your ability to interdict the market and increase their ability to evade detection, because now you got more targets to observe, more networks to try to disrupt, and more organizations to try to take down. But also, focusing on dismantlement to disconnect, it really places a lot of emphasis on the external intervention. It is up to my organization to splinter, to disconnect, to take apart. But when we start thinking about how TCOs fail, we start realizing that there's a whole other aspect that maybe we're not capturing in that approach. So we focus on failure. What we end up finding is that we shift the focus. Rather than disconnecting and changing the structure, let's change the focus to the function. How do we disrupt the function of the network? How does the network's function get impeded and dismantled rather than its structure? And more importantly, this kind of philosophical approach allows for both external initiations as well as internal initiations. If any of you have ever been on a sports team before, you know that your team can suffer because the other team was better, or you guys had a fight the day before between your co-captains of your team. So you can have internal dissension and external intervention that can initiate a failure process. So how can TCOs fail? We're very familiar and understand the concept of interdiction. We rapidly roll up 20 of their key members, we impact their routes, we interdict their capabilities. But if we step back, there are a variety of other channels by which networks and organizations can fail. You have other external disruptions that we talk about on the periphery as being relevant, but areas in which provide new opportunities for us as law enforcement, as investigators, as analysts to take advantage of, to encourage failure of these particular networks. Things like groups co-opting one another, groups competing with one another. Those can initiate a failure process. You've got interruptions from supply. You spray cocoa fields, great. The weather sucks and the bloom season doesn't allow for the production to be as high. That also changes an interdiction or interruption in supply. Demand interruption. There's a change in demand. There's a change in the local demand structure for that particular commodity. These are all external and may not even be directly part of interdiction, but can cause a network, lead to its initiation of a failure process. You also have internal disruptions. Group members desert and they defect. They become informants, which is great. They lead to interdictions, but they might desert or defect on their own. They also, groups as we talked about last session, they can create strategic miscalculations. There's also the room for just that, either accidents or the stupidity that we sometimes see in criminal activity, right? Our concepts of failure have to incorporate that as well. Timothy McVeigh, Oklahoma City bombing, carried out that operation, unfortunately, very effectively. And then how was he ultimately interdicted? Traffic stop. Why? It was expired license plate tag or a broken tail light? Took all the OPSEC for the first part, forgot the second part, right? And we can also have internal dissension that can create tension between organizations that can lead to subordinates not obeying group leadership and create that dissension. But we also have death. That is a node removal that might be a process of interdiction, but people have heart attacks as well. It sounds kind of, why are you talking about people having heart attacks? Because the death of an individual can dramatically disrupt network operations, and that's something that can happen both as a result of interdiction, but also outside of interdiction. But the key thing to realize is these other processes of disruption, dismantlement, these other processes that can lead to failure can also be connected back to interdiction. They can provide opportunities for interdiction. They can provide opportunities for infiltration. They can also provide opportunities for splintering and intersecting that particular network in such a way that leads to its ultimate failure. So I want to talk about failure rather than dismantlement. So, going back to that project, we looked at 8 different networks. We studied we detailed out the process of how they operated, their structure. We saw the network diagrams, and we said, okay, start from the end. Trace back the process. Where did they start from failing? We chose 8 different networks that were very different and distinct. We assumed that there was not going to be a silver bullet, but we all hoped there was going to be a silver bullet that I could share with you, and that would radically change how we counter TCOs, and damn, there wasn't. But there was a lot of great insights, which we'll talk about in a second. There was no one reason for network failure. Interdiction alone was not the reason for network failure. Dissension was not the reason for interdiction failure. Supply interruptions was not the reason for interdiction failure. There was no one reason, which requires us that we have to tailor our interdiction strategies. Common sense, we're very familiar with this framework. But more importantly, and this was a very unique insight, the process of failure for that organization often occurred, but not always, prior to any interdiction. These networks started failing, started having challenges to their ability to carry out their normal operation before law enforcement even arrested a single individual. Before law enforcement was even able to interdict or remove someone from the network. And that was a key finding on there. It means that as analysts, as investigators, not only do we need to understand the leadership structure and profile them, we want to maybe also identify what are the operational stressors within this particular TCO. What are the operational stressors within this particular network? So if we look at those 8 networks, I'm going to pause on this graph for a second. This is a very interesting set of results here that we found when we looked at these 8 networks. We had some networks whose failure, inability to continue their normal operations, was primarily induced by interdiction. That Stewart network that I talked about earlier was one such network. Another one was an illicit trafficking network of nuclear material in Eastern Europe, which in effort was an entire sting operation. It was a German market, that as it referred to try to root out individuals who had supply of nuclear material. But 5 of the networks, their primary initiation of failure was prior to interdiction. And we'll talk about this in a second, but for example, in the Soto Huerto network, the thing that led that network to be discovered, that safe house in Edinburgh to be interdicted, was not because law enforcement solely was doing their job. They were doing their job. They were trying to find those networks. But it resulted from the leader of the organization making a strategic miscalculation, taking it from a smuggling group, which all the members had agreed to, and shifting it to a trafficking group that involves sexual slavery. That strategic miscalculation led to another decision by that particular organization, that leadership, to say, we need to kill one of these women who we've now kept as a sex slave because they're not cooperating. That led to a dissension in the network. That dissension led to those network individuals taking that woman out to the desert, but not killing her and following through on their leadership's commands, but releasing her, who flagged down a car, led law enforcement to the safe house, which then disrupted that particular safe house, leading them to the Motel 6, and we all know what happened after that. So the failure did not start with interdiction, but started with something inside the organization, making them more vulnerable to interdiction. In addition, the wildlife trafficking network, which I haven't really talked a lot about here, it's a very fascinating network. They had co-opted government officials in Brazil to be able to carry out this particular organization. In fact, Brazil at one point clamped down on wildlife trafficking to a very strong degree by instituting a new registry program. If you wanted to move exotic birds and wildlife, they all had to be tagged with an RFID tag and had to be in the government registry. So this organization went to the same company that made those RFID tags and had them produce fake tags for them. And then they bought off individuals in the government to enter fake registrations in the government database. So you stop them, they got the birds, they got the tags, it all looks legit. But the entire operation was fake. That organization was not disrupted solely because law enforcement was doing their job. In fact, they had a law enforcement investigation going on, and then they had an administrative investigation against the government officials going on. Both of these went on for a year, and neither one of them knew of each other. We never heard that before, right? 2 investigations going on of this network, neither one of them talked to one another until there was a member of the network that deserted the network. They were fed up, they felt they weren't getting paid what they should be paid, and they became an informant on the administrative investigation, which then led to a greater discovery of these technologies and strategies, which then led to a discovery of, oh my God, there's a law enforcement investigation going on, maybe we should talk. From that point, when those 2 investigations were started talking to one another, to when the network was fully failed and prevented from continuing normal operations, was something like 3 months. Once they talked, boom, they were able to bring the network down. But not until someone was willing to desert the organization, even though they were under surveillance, even though there's law enforcement operations. And then we have an organization like Sister Ping. This is the human smuggling network from China. This is actually probably the most complex situation because you had multiple processes going on. In one situation, you had that takedown of the Thai airport, that interdiction. That led to her choosing a boat. And we all know how that turned out in New York City with that boat running aground on a sandbar off Far Rockaway, killing 14 of the Chinese nationals and having 260 of them trying to swim ashore, and led to a very large and very operation to try to rescue those individuals. But there was also a disruption in supply. Outside of interdiction, there was a disruption in supply. In fact, there were market pressures. We were talking earlier in the break about market forces. Tiananmen Square happened in '89. In 1990, there was an act by the US government to encourage asylum by Chinese nationals. All of a sudden, Sister Ping had a network where she maybe was moving 15, 20 people a month through there. Now had a demand of 300. So you had a supply disruption, an increase in supply. Now she's got to make demand. Now she's got to take this, which changes her risk tolerance. Says, we got to get more people through. Oh crap, the airport's down. What kind of process can we use to get 300 people across? I know, let's use a boat. She'd used boats before, but never a cargo vessel. She'd worked with other snakeheads before, but never these snakeheads. And there's a whole fascinating story that I could spend an hour on about this particular network. In fact, we talk about OSINT, and open source intelligence. There was just as an aside, this boat was going from China through Thailand to Mombasa, Kenya. It's called the Golden Venture. It was actually changed name. It's called Golden Venture along the way. There was an article in the South China Morning Post about a day before it reaches Kenya. The article said, Chinese officials have tried to stop a boat with 270 Chinese nationals that just left Thailand. It's called the Golden Venture. But back then, in '93, we didn't have open source information gathering systems to harvest headlines and things like that. So the one officer that was stationed for East Africa said, wasn't aware of this, and he heard through intelligence, golden something. There was something golden something. Well, in the same port, at the same time this boat, the Golden Venture was, there was another boat called like Gold Fortune. So that's the boat. So they followed that boat down to the coast of Africa, down to the Cape in South Africa. And they boarded that boat to find nothing but bulk iron ore, missing the Golden Venture that sailed right past them, right? So it's lots of fascinating stories, and I have case studies I can share with you on that. So we have some that were primarily interdiction, but a lot that started failing prior to interdiction. And if we understand these processes of failures, what that does, it opens up potential avenues for interdiction, potential avenues for other strategies we can take to try to disrupt and ultimately lead to the failure of these networks. So let's talk about two networks in particular. That Canadian importation network had a very stable supply of marijuana coming in from Canada into the United States. Last estimates, they moved, I think, 1,000 to 2,000 pounds per month coming in of marijuana, and by the end of it, about 100 to 200 pounds of cocaine coming in and out to Canada on a monthly basis. DEA had them under surveillance. They were watching them, right? They were monitoring them. They took advantage. Remember, this is a network that was started failure from interdiction. So they found an opportunity, found a courier, flipped the courier, interdicted the money shipment, put him in a bind to say they got to make the money up. So he shifted, reprioritized to cocaine operations to try to cover his debt. He knew it was less familiar. He needed a new partner. In comes in Bob from the DEA, ready to be his new partner, his new pilot. By the way, this network, very fascinating. They were once they got into Canada, they had a domestic commercial aviation distribution network. They would fly commercial planes from Canada, from Washington State to Atlanta, Iowa, I think Wisconsin, Las Vegas, a variety of airports. But the leaders never actually went with the shipments, but they flew commercial at the same time. So the shipments were on a private plane. The leaders flew commercial so that they could be at the site to supervise the transfer to the distributors. So there was a great opportunity with this that if you interdicted the distribution transfer between the transporter and the distributor, you pick up not only that portion of the segment, but one of the key leaders who was supervising that transfer, because they didn't really trust one another. So they found their opportunity, they created an infiltration opportunity, and that ultimately led to its failure as a result of that opportunity being born. But let's compare that to the Alcazar network. Here's a guy that's operating for 37 years. I mean, you want to talk about the amount of weapons that he's provided. Large-scale shipments. We're talking about thousands of firearms, 200 to 400 RPGs in any one shipment, massive scale. He equipped armies that were embargoed from having access. Interestingly enough, he was also an affiliate. He was appointed an authority, a government official from the Federal Democratic Republic of Yemen. That's actually how he transported a lot of his goods in the late 80s, early 90s. He had a legitimate documentation and passage documentation for his cargo from the Federal Democratic Republic of Yemen. One of his shipments was finally interdicted because a port officer who was from Sweden at this point, but operating at an international port officer realized in looking at this particular shipment that the Federal Democratic Republic of Yemen had not existed for 2 years. He said, they don't exist anymore. And that led to an interdiction of that particular shipment. But remember, he didn't use the transporter crews rarely but once. So that didn't affect him, he just lost that shipment. So he was effectively arming insurgencies pre and post the end of the Cold War. But his failure was not necessarily started with the DEA's 2-year interdiction investigation that happened. His failure started when market demand for his products changed. Post-Cold War, fewer needs for revolutionaries, fewer needs for large-scale insurgencies. Remember, if you harken back to that time many years ago, peace was like on the horizon. It was a new world dawn. You don't need 200 RPGs in the MENA region because the Cold War had ended. So that market shift changed his risk tolerance. Because you know what? He still liked to live large. In fact, he was known, his nickname was called the Prince of Marbella. He lived in Marbella, Spain. And like I said before, he was actually profiled in a magazine called Paris Watch, which is a very famous kind of socialite magazine of Paris. So an arms trafficker is profiled in a French socialite magazine. Showed you that he didn't really always care about visibility. He was known. He had contacts in intelligence agencies around the world. So his risk tolerance shifted. He still needed the money, but people weren't buying. DEA saw an opportunity. That change in demand created an opportunity where DEA could put two individuals posing as buyers from FARC. He'd never worked with FARC before. In fact, he didn't know if he should go through the deal. He contacted his contact in the Spanish intelligence and said, should I go through this deal? Spanish intelligence guy said, hell no. But he needed the money. Market had changed. Demand had changed. So he decided that he rarely worked with people he didn't know. So he changed that risk tolerance. He worked with that. He ignored the advice from his own intelligence folks that he had co-opted. And then he was arrested by U.S. and Spanish police, not Spanish intelligence, but Spanish police, in 2008 in Spain on his way to go complete the deal in Colombia. So one network starts with interdiction as the initiation of failure. One network starts with changing market demand as the initiation of failure. The key thing is, how do these present opportunities? How do these present abilities for us to provide greater efforts for interdiction and strategies? And I come back to this point, which we talked about. There is no one strategy. If someone tells you there's one strategy, you should ignore them, right? But with this process of failing often beginning prior to interdiction, in addition to looking at the structure of the network and its supply chain, start looking about where might be those stressors. Where are there unknown or contentious familial relationships? How does this network, which I know we were talking about at the break, comparing networks within or organizations within the marketplace for particular organizations, is there a dissension or other competition that could encourage this particular network to change their strategy, to change their operations? How do we find these points of interdiction that create new opportunities? You can surveil a network all you want, but until there's a need for individuals to come into that organization, until there's a need for new partners or to change new routes, you may not have the ability to infiltrate that organization. And sometimes we say, hey, we arrested a guy that opened up a new route, but sometimes those new routes change because markets shift, people die, groups compete with one another. How can we incorporate that in? So what I want to also kind of focus on this section is the concept of looking at resilience, right? Because we have networks that last for a long time. How are they resilient? And oftentimes, we're so driven by link analysis, we approach everything from a link perspective. I've got the network, right? It's like when you're I got the pin map, I know where crime occurs. You know where crime is reported. You don't always know where crime occurs. You know what links have been reported. You don't always know where those actual operations suffer. So when we talk about resilience, we talk about this concept of the ability to maintain and replace actors and linkages and make strategic trade-offs between differentiation of function and integration. The ability to respond to an intervention or an interdiction and be able to keep going on their normal function. We can also term this to be an ability to resist failure. And so we take a network approach from our targeting, from our interdiction, from our investigation. We talk about where are those links redundant, right? Where do they have backup links that could be that we could target that might provide the ability to replace? And who are those nodes that are replaceable, right? We take this transport crew out. What other transport crews does that particular network have? But I want to offer that we should take a little bit different approach. If we approach it from a supply chain, we were talking at the break about this, about how the evolving dynamics of cartels right now often prevents the ability for a single leader to stay in power for a long period of time. Either they're arrested, interdicted, killed, whatever the competition that emerges. But that still doesn't mean that there isn't a role of a kingpin that is constantly being refilled. So just because new technology has developed and pushed forward new forms of communication and evasion of detection doesn't mean that the traditional forms of organization have gone away. Few cartels have gotten rid of their leadership and went to a board of directors approach. Few cartels have done this kind of because there's always a need for the person at the top to make the final decision. Always a need for that's the person who's going to be the person in charge and the kingpin. So there's roles that continue even though the personnel changes. So we shift from a network approach to a supply chain approach. We shift from looking at links and nodes to looking at roles and pathways. So in our approach, looking at these 8 networks, we did this. And again, this is really meant to provide just an overview. I can send you gargantuously too long of a report that goes into this more in detail. We want to approach this and look at redundancy. First question we looked at is, from a role and operational redundancy across different segments of the supply chain, how redundant were these organizations? And what we find is, to no surprise, the drug trafficking networks were the two at the top, had lots of redundancy. They had multiple transport crews, multiple distributors, multiple brokers. They were able to have redundancy, so if one was taken out, they could replace another in that role. It might be a new market, it might be a new route, but they had the individuals in process to be able to replace and provide that redundancy. And then also, in their retail and consumer-driven environments in that supply chain, they also had a lot of redundancy when it comes to can they find new customers? If the demand shifts, are there more customers out there, right? Because for some of these commodities, very specialized. There's only a few commodity customers for exotic wildlife. Lots of customers for fentanyl or opioids or other forms of drugs. There may be a few customers for radiological and nuclear material, and lots of customers for wanting to be smuggled via a human smuggling organization or want to receive the end product of a trafficking organization. But some networks, especially the most short-lived networks, tended to have limited redundancy. Remember that Soto Huerto network down in Edinburgh? They moved people repetitively. Their cycle operations were constantly moving individuals across from the border into Edinburgh and then up through Falfurrias, up towards safe houses in Houston, and then broadly, and then they distributed elsewhere. But they had very little redundancy. It was those 6, 7, 8 guys, and that was it. They didn't branch out. They didn't have other relationships they could leverage. It was just that group. So once that group was interdicted, once some members of that group were disrupted, that group had nowhere really to turn to readjust, adapt, and be resilient. Compare that to the cocaine importation network. You cut my Mexico route off, I've got a Dominican route. You cut my Dominican route, I've got a Cuban route. You cut my Cuban route off, I've got another route. And they had multiple routes to move their product through. So that level of redundancy, it varied across these networks, but it's a way of focusing on where are the segments in the supply chain that are most vulnerable for that particular network. Where are the financial segments that are most vulnerable, right? What networks have the least redundancy in their financial operations, and what, as we're starting to see a lot more deprofessionalization of some of the money laundering capabilities, what parts of networks are more redundant? This is also a very key location where technology can come in. Technology might be able to provide an ability to bolster one's redundancy by recruiting new members in that particular capability. What's on the dark network? What's available in the deep web that it might allow individuals to recruit new retailers, new distributors? What might be new ways of finding new suppliers, especially when we move away from more naturally produced drugs to more synthetic drugs that have much more of an industrial supply chain compared to an agricultural production-based supply chain. So this is one way of looking at resilience from a supply chain that's different than saying this person is central. It's really about this node is central. This role, instead of saying what this node is central, we say this role is central. But we did it another way. We talked about this concept of cross-functionality. And here's the thing. Networks are a function, and organizations are a function, not only of the individual roles that people play, but that people can often share roles. Your transporter might also be a backup distributor. Your distributor might also be a backup individual to market and cut your product for the retail market. Your grower might also be a transporter. Individuals can serve multiple roles, and more importantly, there are connections between individuals who serve in roles that provide communication patterns that are different than if we just look at the network. So what might be another way that we could look at it? And so one of the things we did here was we created a network diagram, but instead of putting individuals and the links between individuals, we looked at roles and the links between roles found within individuals. The links between roles that were based upon the individuals who served primarily in those roles. So let's take two drug smuggling networks. We have a very decentralized drug smuggling network. We have a little bit more centralized drug smuggling network, right? But if we look at the relationships between roles rather than the relationship between people, a different perspective emerges. So these are a number of roles within the organization. Your particular networks might have a different set of roles, right? Your particular might be a grow operator, it might be a particular transporter. So we have general categories of supplier, transportation, distribution, brokers, financial, what we call group management. And some of these networks also had connections with political or public officials to provide them cover. But what we find here is these are two drug smuggling networks, but the density of connections between the roles vary dramatically. So in the Stewart network, it was really about a network that was a transportation and brokering network, because that's where the majority of connections existed. It's where the majority of the people talk to each other. The size of the dots, by the way, are the number of people that are in that role. So if you have a very small dot, but lots of connections, that means that small number of people are widely connected to a large number of roles. If you have a large dot with a few connections to another large dot, that means that those two roles had lots of people, but they were not well connected to one another. So if we look at this diagram, you see another way, another view from a functional perspective rather than a network perspective of these relationships and where you might find opportunities for disruption. So for the Stewart network, you look at the main components that connected there were transportation and brokers and coordinators. But management had a role in the transportation, supply, distribution, and broker relationships. There was connections there. If we look at the Prada network for a second, we see a different picture emerge. We see a lot of partners. We see a lot of other groups that partnered with Prada. We see a lot of other groups that partnered with them, and they were heavily connected to the financial side. So let's think about this for a second. This particular network smuggled cocaine, and by the estimates over the course from, let's say, about 1990 to about 2004, when their cocaine really started winding down, it was about 25,000 kilos over the course of the network. So this was a large scale. Their largest shipment that was interdicted was about 4,500 kilos. And their largest shipment, they also had shipments that went to, they had about 15,000 kilos interdicted and an estimated 25,000 kilos that were not. So this is a very large scale importation, right? But they were also partners. They partnered with other production groups and suppliers to be a conduit for that cocaine into the US market. But because there were pre-existing relationships between those partners and the financial, which is in the bottom left corner there, and those connections were heavy, when the cocaine stopped or was reduced through interdiction, they had a thriving separate business for laundering funds for those partners and subcontractors. So this gives an idea about what might be some of those splinters, but not from a network perspective, different groups that form, but new markets or roles that might emerge if you interdict or disrupt that particular network. And so if we look at all 8 of our networks, we see a lot of great differences. Now, Alcazar, very centralized network, very leader-driven. So where would you find the most connections? Back to management, back to the key leader, back to Alcazar himself. Compare that to the Sister Ping network. Strongest connections were actually between transportation and enforcers. This is because Sister Ping used a Chinatown gang called the Fuqing gang as not only their key onshoring essential group that would essentially meet the boats 30 miles offshore, transport the individuals and bring them onshore, but they were also the enforcers that enforces the collection of repayment from the individuals who once they got onshore. So when that network started fragmenting, and it fragmented for a variety of reasons, that network started being disrupted. The enforcers and the transporters actually started going at war with one another. This is actually a very interesting story. They had the boat, 270 Chinese nationals, and they actually had a clear pathway to a dock in New York City. The problem was there was no onshoring crew that could offload the boat. The reason is their group that they worked with, the Fuqing gang, had an internal dissension. One leader didn't like another leader who was interacting with another one, and so that other leader left and took some of the key members. That first leader put a hit out on that second leader at a beeper store. Remember beepers, right? That hit failed, so he put a counter hit. It's called the Teaneck Massacre in Teaneck, New Jersey. And he either killed or drove into hiding or ultimately were arrested all of the transporter crew that remained for that network. The problem was, this is before you had massive cellular technology connectivity and people could get smartphone intercept, so there was a gap in communications. So the boat was on its way to New York City, could not know that there was no crew until it got actually to New York City. But there was a dock, there was no police presence, they could have pulled the boat up, offshored it, but there was no crew to offshore it. So the guys on the boat made a decision. They said, well, we can't do this. Let's go to Far Rockaway and try to do a beach landing, right? Any of you are from New York or Far Rockaway, bad idea, sandbars. They didn't know this. So they had a guy actually with a flashlight on the beach trying to signal them in where to do the beach landing, and they hit a sandbar. And that's what led to its discovery, the failure of the network ultimately. But they could have succeeded even in spite of all this. They just didn't have a actual crew to help them. So, I've whetted your appetite for some of these things, and there's a lot more in depth we can go on. But what I want to do is I want to highlight kind of where does this end, right? Where are we at right now? And I want to make the argument first by highlighting some key takeaways from this presentation. If you leave here with nothing else, I want you to leave with this slide. First, target removal for leaders, target at least 2 leaders. Hit that optimal fragmentation rate, or that feasible fragmentation of 60%. Go from 1 to 2. It's one small strategy. 2, networks don't always positively adapt. They sometimes have a failure to adapt, and that creates opportunities that one can use for their advantage when interdicting. 3rd, don't pursue dismantlement and disconnection. Pursue failure. Pursue the inability to continue their normal operation, which leaves you, rather than with a bunch of splintered groups that can still meet market demand, leads to a potential underlying change in the ability for organizations to meet that particular market. 4, failure is more than interdiction. Failure can be co-opted by interdiction. Interdiction can take advantage of other processes going on in these networks. But the more you can gather about the dissension, the distrust, the desertion, the more you can gather about other types of disruptions to supply and demand that happen, the more it creates opportunities for infiltration, for surveillance, and ultimately for law enforcement to be able to come in and do a much more complete interdiction of the network. 5th, resilience is both structural and functional. Take your link analysis, take that nice, clean visualization we all love, take it one step further. What's it look like when you map it on roles rather than just solely the links between individuals? What does it look like? What are the gaps? What are the processes in the supply chain that can be disrupted from a role or functional base? And where are the networks most redundant and the networks most disruptible? And 5th, unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. There's no one reason for failure. There's nothing you can take back to your leadership to say, hey, we've got the one silver bullet, we're going to interdict it, and we're going to utilize it. So that's key takeaways from today. Problem is, the science is still very young. There's still a hell of a lot you don't know. People brought it up here just today. What about all the changing technology? These networks are old. What about new forms of communication? What about Telegram? What about WhatsApp? What about cryptocurrencies? What about new forms of informal money trading? What about new opportunities that are formed through technology, new products? Fully agree with you on all of that. You made the point for me, gentlemen, on that actual case, that there is a gap. And it's because I want to argue there's a problem with this researcher-practitioner partnership and the lack of available data on this. Most studies in this particular environment involve 1 or 2 organizations. This was the largest organizational study that we have seen so far, with 8 organizations across 5 commodities. But that's it. How does that generalize to El Paso? How does that generalize to different environments and different commodities? How does that generalize to other environments? We don't know because the science is still young. There are few, if any, actual studies of actual interdiction strategies. You want to know if you arrest this key leader, what will happen? Most of the studies out there are simulations. Oh, if you take this out, but there's not actually many studies, if any, that actually say, here is what happened when you interdicted this individual. Here's how the network actually responded. But if we just take one network and we try to generalize from that, we might get misleading approaches. It's not about one or two, it's about 100. It's about what does this field tell us? What does practices overall tell us about interdiction that really truly works and doesn't? There's a lot of quantitative analysis and a lot of developments that are going on, but most of them is about analyzing a single network. What happens when we want to compare across networks? And last, I want to mention that most of these studies have been originating outside of the United States. And I want to highlight this for a second. And I've put some individuals' names up here, so if you ever want, you have the slides, you go home, you're like, what are other people that are researching this environment? You could look some of these individuals up. But one of the key areas in which the research in dismantling, disrupting TCOs and criminal networks has happened outside the United States. Canada, Italy, UK. Dutch intelligence actually embeds criminologists and network scientists that are publishing in academia in their actual intelligence units to translate the work that they're doing to improve science. And the primary driver has been the willingness by those agencies to share data. If we're honest with ourselves, there's a trust gap between the academy and practitioners. As a practitioner myself, there was a trust gap. We had a lot of experiences, and I was sharing them earlier, where we were working with the university and it was a bad experience. We were willing to work with them and all they wanted was our data and not to help us in any capacity. They just saw this as a source of information rather than a partner in exploring and developing these strategies. There's been a lot of bad blood that has happened in this area, especially in context and encountering transnational criminal networks. But there's an opportunity here. You have scientists in the US, and here's just a list of some of them, who are already working on criminal network disruption. They work with APD, a police department or an agency to try to get some access to criminal intelligence data, to be able to do some analysis. Canada will provide access to criminal network data for an entire region, the entire area of British Columbia, or another state, another region within Canada, or province. Here we're working with a city PD or this PD. There's an opportunity that we're missing here in the United States. But more importantly to that, there are mathematicians, network scientists, people way smarter than we can even imagine, who have the technological capabilities and the training to do things that are amazing to disrupting and dismantling networks. Problem is, they don't have any data. Great example, U.S. Army supports something called the Network Science Collaborative Technical Alliance. This is a 10-year effort funded at $150 million to push network science forward. They're in years, like I think 7 and 8 of that network. Doing amazing work. The problem is, their test data. They don't have criminal intelligence data. They don't have some of the big data systems like Palantir that you have. You know what they're doing in their test data? They're using LinkedIn. They're using Yelp. They're using whatever data that they have available to test their algorithms. What happens if we were to pair those up with law enforcement and criminal intelligence data to try to identify a pathway going forward for this? What happens if they worked with ICE data and worked alongside with ICE to try to develop some new capabilities for identifying new ways of disrupting, identifying, or locating criminal networks that might be in need for removal or working with HSI in that context? So what's really needed, and the argument that I want to pitch here, is a data warehouse of what we call ground truth network and operational data on TCOs. That's available to practitioners, researchers, and technology developers. And the next question you're going to say is, FOUO, LES, data access, trust gap. What are you going to do with my data? So here's my pitch. I have you captive in a room, webcast lines, so of course I'm going to make a pitch. Call it Project 100. We want to make available, we want to collect code and make available network and operational data for 100 TCOs. Not 1, not 5, not 10, but 100 TCOs. We want to code this data, and we want TCOs in the United States. Law enforcement would provide access to case files from closed investigations. We already use court records, part of closed investigations for the research that's out there. But opportunity, there's a lot, as you've mentioned, in case files that aren't available there. UAlbany and other partners who are willing to engage in this would extract and code structured data from the case files. You saw the link analysis, you saw the functional analysis, the role-based analysis, you saw communications, geospatial information, there's a whole host of data. The problem is, once you extract that data, which you may have in your systems already, it's FOUO, LES. It's operationally sensitive. We'll then take that data, and we're not going to share it with the public. That data is not, it stays FOUO LES. But what we want to do is, we want to strip PII, so it's in compliance with privacy requirements. We want to move and remove any agency identification. So if El Paso shared closing case investigation, it doesn't tie back to this is the El Paso investigation, right? Or the El Paso PD or Sheriff's Office. We would also work with a variety of methodologies to fuzzy the data, but still keep its operational relevance. So if you had geographic information, we put it on a transparent plane such that you never know it's actually part of El Paso. It's part of a two-dimensional plane of some random city that's never been identified, but it's there for use and analysis. And there are methodologies that use this quite often to work with cell phone data that cell companies release, to work with a variety of other entities. And then that anonymized data set. This is where you're supposed to get tense. You're supposed to say, that anonymized data set, after it's gone through rounds of testing, after it's gone through many data use agreements between myself and lawyers at UAlbany and other partners and your agency's lawyers, would be released. We don't have data on TCOs. You want to leapfrog the science of counter TCOs? Find a way to make an anonymized data set that's available for researchers, practitioners, and other communities. Think about the training opportunities, right? Think about what information can be learned from your case files that can help equip counter-TCO operations on the northern border, help TCO in New York or in other locations. Most of that information is driven by anecdote, right? It's driven from investigation. But what can be those new opportunities, new advances? I showed you the identification, the finding the weak nodes, talking about dissociative network, talking about some of the new advances that can be identified. What is locked away in our closed case investigations that remains an untapped resource that can be leveraged for the counter-TCO capabilities? We already do this in a lot of cases. We have groups like EPIC and others that are doing research on the high side or doing research internally about criminal market disruption, looking at things from what effect the laws have on marijuana production in Colorado and South there have had on other types of networks and capabilities. But what opportunities are we missing by not having this kind of resource? And how do we move counter-TCOs, the fight against TCOs, from anecdote-driven to evidence-based? Now, you might say, it's possible, it's never going to be done, no way you can do it, too many hurdles. Problem is, it's been done before. How many of you have heard of the concept of predictive policing in your law enforcement agencies? Raise your hand. Right? So you got no predictive policing? Ever heard that concept before? Okay. We can forecast where crime is going to occur, says Minority Report. Or we can forecast where general trends of crime are heading at a particular location. This is a new advance, right? But where did this start? Start researchers at universities doing this? No. Origination was pin maps. Our trusty old friend, the pin map. You had a pin map on your station wall of all your apprehensions or all your traffic stops, all your crimes. You started seeing patterns. You said, you know what, these things cluster together. This one neighborhood, one community, there's a lot of crime going on there. So, LEOs decided selectively in small partnerships with trusted researchers to share their data. They built these partnerships, late 80s, early 90s. They shared this information. From there, the researchers were able to bring in technologies from geospatial analysis and others to look at things and created the concept of hotspots, right? We now get hotspot maps every day, but 30 years ago, this was a new concept in the context of law enforcement. Hotspots then led to new revised policing strategies. Maybe we focused our enforcement in targeted areas. Maybe we target our resources where there's clusters of crime. That led LEOs to say, you know what, we need to share more crime data, but make it publicly available. Make the crime incident data or aspects of fields of that available on our website. Now when you're searching for a home, you get a crime index of crime in that community where you're buying a home. Now when you're looking at research on what impacts does crime have on health and on environmental conditions, right, things, it's all made available because LEOs were willing to share that particular data publicly available. And not everything, but select relevant fields. That led then to other fields to come in, mathematicians. In fact, there's a company called Predpol, one of the leading developers of predictive policing capabilities. Their basis, their background methodology, they're all mathematicians. You know how they developed it? You know how they developed their technology? They started applying methodologies from earthquake prediction to crime prediction. And they found a unique similarity. Just as earthquakes can start from a small number of rumblings that rapidly accelerate to a big trembler, crime patterns also exhibited some similarities in this. And they use this to be able to create an operational tool that can be then deployed in the field. And now you have officers in a number of cities that are changing their particular patrolling strategies based upon these results. But I highlight this because this all just started not from researchers, but from law enforcement organizations. From information and understanding that you had already and a willingness to step out and reach out. So to end for our Q&A, I'm interested, you don't have to put up any hands today, but I'm looking for partners in this. This is something to help advance our understanding of countering TCOs and our ability to push that science forward so that you have science that's more operationally relevant, science that you can take to the tactical level and put in the field, but also science that your experience can be shared with other agencies and other capabilities and other folks that are in this particular fight. And so with that, we're moving to a Q&A session. Questions on any of this?
Do I need a bribe with another chance point?
Questions? Or what do you think of the proposal? Again, curse words are allowed, right?
Question for you, sir.
Yeah.
What systems are you talking about that you guys are using? Is it Google Earth? Is it Palantir? I think I heard you say ArcGIS. What systems or tools are you using to?
The research community is system agnostic, right? So, we've used Palantir and have had access to it through some special programs that Palantir made available. Previously, we heavily used ArcGIS, social network analysis programs, structured data sources, unstructured textual analysis, natural language processing, machine learning. I can go on. It's not about the platform. We can find a platform that works, right? It's about as people have talked about, data is the new oil, right? Well, what is that oil when it counters TCOs, right? How can we leverage that to build a new engine of innovation for countering transnational criminal networks and organizations? And more importantly, from just an honest perspective, how can the academy do research that is relevant to you rather than there being this still gap and divide, right? How can we advance technology and science that you can then take and implement in your particular organization? Say, this is really helpful. I'm glad there was a study on this. I'm glad we can use this on the field today. Other thoughts? Yes?
What are your thoughts on applying this to Mexico, Colombia, countries that we know that their governments are very corrupt and maybe aren't interested in studies like this? A lot of the U.S. TCOs obviously have their sources of supply in countries that are not doing studies like the UK and Canada are doing. So how do you see us being able to apply that to our big problems here, which is the Mexican TCO?
So, a couple of things. Great question, by the way. First thing is, you get information on Mexican TCOs. We don't get all the information because their production facilities, their locations, things on part of their supply chain. Through your investigations, you just don't have access to it. But that's part of a missing data problem, right? So if we say, okay, what we'd really like to know is we would like technology or an algorithm that could take that particular data at last known point. We have the supply chain from a Mexican TCO that ends here. We know in this particular city. Can we use satellite imagery? Can we use land cover analysis, which has already been done on a lot of marijuana interdiction and drug and counter drug interdiction, to identify likely grow locations for that particular product, or likely locations where individuals might be gathering. Now, it doesn't give you the endpoint data that you ever get from the government, but it might supplement some of the information you have in your investigation. But that's the question you raised right there is something that the Academy is both aware of from a missing data problem, but also not aware of because we don't build those interactions with you. So the question is, you have data on those Mexican TCOs. There's a lot of information that can be leveraged against, again, all the information you saw here, except for the wildlife trafficking network, was all U.S. court records that were found in U.S. investigations. But yet we were still able to track down safe houses and stash houses and locations in Canada, Colombia, and a variety of other locations through that. Was there still missing data? Yes. Are there applications for partner collaboration that could be improved? Potentially, but here you have an operation where you can say, how can researchers in Canada who are already doing this help us in building some of the Canada-US investigations and science approaching this? How can we work with the folks in Mexico? Maybe not everyone, but there are researchers in Mexico that are working on this exact problem. They're looking at leadership decapitation and drug trafficking networks. But they're having to use open source data right now.
Yeah, I guess I'm just seeing, from a DEA perspective, he may know where somebody is, where this guy is, but all we can do is say, hey, Mexican government or military, go get him. But how do we, bridge that gap and say, instead of the kingpin strategy that clearly hasn't been working for the past 10, 12 years, try these other things. I mean, I don't know if you have suggestions on how to do that with a country that maybe isn't as cooperative.
Right, so what this technology won't, or this application won't do is solve the political problem, right? And the issue of cooperation. And if anyone else tells you that it can, they're lying, right? But this can maybe highlight, okay, that person, we know where they are in Mexico, we encourage them, try to get them, we can't do anything. What is the next person down? Maybe that next person down is in the United States, or maybe that next person down is in a location that you is more accessible, or you have a more cooperative relationship with that agency in that particular location. And so, go back to that key player analysis, right? You can't get the kingpin. Kingpin's insulated, right? But we identified a number of other people that you could disrupt that still fragment the network. And maybe some of those individuals are within your AOR that you don't have access to when you're just targeting solely the kingpin. So it's meant to be a tool to add rather than a strategy to replace. Does that make sense?
Brandon, here, can we go up here?
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I have a question, which is really sort of how we can be of service as a university here at UTEP and with the research that we do in particular. And what I'm trying to ask is that, on the one hand, what makes El Paso so attractive to criminal organizations is this trade route, the ability to get things into the United States efficiently. Also, it's this, as you were mentioning, this lack of trust between jurisdictions, so it creates kind of a space to operate in. And our institute does a lot of market analysis in the region, Texas, New Mexico, and Chihuahua. And transnational criminal organizations are, as you were showing, just like any other market player, just from a sort of illicit perspective. So how can the work that we do, whether we're analyzing the energy sector, water, banking and finance, supply chains, ports of entry, how can we be of service to our law enforcement organizations, our governments, if we're doing that, core research on market analysis between these jurisdictions, even if our core research isn't TCOs or criminal organizations?
Well, I think you need to talk to the gentleman from Epic over there who was just telling me about a market analysis that he was doing on something similar in that context that would be relevant. I mean, part of that is having meetings like this, right? And having those discussions, right? But discussions are one thing. How do you build a formalized relationship, right? How do you go and meet with Epic, and how does Epic allow you to come in, learn their organization? I mean, this is a dating relationship, right? There's a level of trust that's involved in this, and there's always a hesitancy on both sides. So I think part of it is, from the academy, we need to look at, rather than having the literature drive our questions, we need to say, what are their questions? What is their operational needs? What questions do they have that they need answers for? And how does that align with our own individual research incentives? From an organizational perspective, it's okay, where do we need help? And where could we leverage the 800-pound brains that are in a lot of our university institutions to aid and support us, not to replace us, not to tell us what to do, because don't come to an academic to tell you what to do in this context, right? But how can the research that you do on the market tie into the operational questions that EPIC has, or that El Paso PD has, or Sheriff's Office, or Border Patrol and Customs, right? Maybe there's something that's relevant to the market analysis you're doing that Customs and Border Protection and their ports of entry need as far as understand how markets are shifting and changing those dynamics coming through. So it's not just about, my proposal is about TCOs, but TCOs are always embedded in a market structure. But the thing is, you and I need to talk with them, and we all need to talk together about how do we bring these components of analysis together? How do we talk and build these relationships so that we can push the entire science forward and not just leave it as anecdote driven? We have time for one more?
We have time for one more question, Danny, if the gentleman.
We talked about a lot of interdiction with law enforcement and how we can dismantle it. Have you ever thought about the concept of indirectly affecting a TCO's network by propaganda, some type of open media, hey,
Directed communication, right?
Communication to the open society, saying, hey, these guys are the bad guys, and let them adapt that way.
So, yes, we've actually talked about that. It's actually embedded within a lot of context of deterrence along the border and the concepts of deterring adversaries from selecting certain high threat pathways and deterring them or dissuading them to go to a lower threat pathway when it comes to things like smuggling weapons and things like that. But one of the challenges that you face in that is you're trying to undermine the public support for those organizations, right? And so the question is, to what extent does the public support? And this public support is really kind of there's three parts here. Either there's, I don't want to talk about it because I just want to live my life. There's, I'm scared because there's violence every day on the streets and I just need to keep my head down. Or there's actual support for that particular organization. So my brother's in it, my sister's in it, my cousin's in it. So each one of those would have a different response to your deterrent mechanism, but still connecting that back in directly to the underlying organization. What would it weaken? What do they need public support for? Right? Maybe you could simulate a strategy where it talks about making the lowest level members who are weakly connected more visible and more willing to flip. So you can then identify and simulate what impact would that have on that particular network if they flipped and rolled up and carry that particular forward. But there's also, as was raised, a missing data problem. You only know what you know about networks between those you've already identified. But here's where science can come in. Here's where there are strategies for identifying missing data, missing links in networks that you don't recognize from your own cell phone communications, but because of their relationships with so many other people, these two nodes have to know each other because they know so many other people. It may not show up in the call record, but that's because they never talk on the phone with one another. But they know each other in person because they have so many links with so many other individuals. So that's where science can come in and kind of aid in some of that. So to answer your direct question, yes, we've thought about it. There's opportunities there. There'll be a lot of discussion on how to tie those directed communications indirectly to TCO operations. But that is not an impossible task. There is science that we can leverage in there. There's science that we can bring in, and that there's science that can be improved upon by your analysis and your data and your insights as well. There's a lot of academics who want to help in this context, but they're only limited by the folks that are surrounding them and agencies around them. That's why El Paso is such a nice environment to come down and talk, because look at how many people are sitting here talking about this issue, right? But also they're also impacted by what data they have available. If you want to know about cryptocurrency and the impact it's having on transnational criminal organizations, who has that data? If it's only at an FOU LES level or even higher in that context, it's very difficult to leverage that academic insight. So what can we do to build those connections? And I'm done with time.
Thank you.